You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanders,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is...
Thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today I am super excited to have Lucy Clarke on the show with me. She has an amazing new book. It's called One of the Girls, and if you're looking for a little spookiness, shall we say, to go along with your warm, bright summer days, this is the contrast you are looking for this summer reading series. One of the Girls, one of the most fun, twisty thrillers that I've read in a while. I know you're going to love it as much as I did. Welcome to the show, Lucy.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here.
It's wonderful to have you. Lucy, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
I think that for me, it came quite late, actually. I wasn't a child that wrote pages and pages of stories and dreamed of being a writer. I actually kept a journal throughout my teens and loved it, and I studied English literature at university, but again missed the signs that writing could be a career. I just thought it was a sort of gateway to other careers, I suppose, English literature. And actually, it was when I had some space in my 20s and I went traveling for 6 months. On that trip, I just had a lot of time to read and to write my own travel journal. And it was during that trip that I just remember sitting outside. We camped. I was with my boyfriend at the time, who's now my husband, and we just kind of camped our way, actually coast to coast across America and Canada. And and I just knew that when I got home, when I flew home from that trip, I didn't want to go back to my job, which was in advertising. And what I had loved most of all about these travels were having the space to write. And I just made the decision then to give it a go. So that was it for me.
So, Lucy, if you didn't necessarily see yourself as a writer or, couldn't see that potential at the time, when you studied English literature, what sort of career did you think that you would have with this education?
Yeah, I just did English literature because for the very simple reason it was a subject at school it was my strongest subject and I enjoyed it. And I thought it's a really broad topic that can take me in any direction. And I didn't know really what I wanted to do. I'd assumed I would run my own business one day because that's what my dad had done. And so when I graduated, I actually started out working in advertising for the first few years, thinking that that's sort of, a pathway. I'd start there and see what unfolded. And I just didn't love it. I didn't fall in love with that world, the corporate world at all. And I think one of the wonderful things about having the time to travel was that you break out of your normal routines and the expectations that perhaps you set yourself. There wasn't anyone else heaping pressure on me. It was just myself thinking, oh yes, I'll have a business career and earn good money. And then I went away and I thought, that doesn't feel quite so important out here. Actually, what do I really want to do? And then that turned out to be writing.
Now, advertising, I find that fascinating. Were you on the creative side or more of the business side?
I was an account executive, so I was management really. So So you're the liaison between your clients and the creative department. And I used to find myself hanging out all the time upstairs with the creators and the design team. So obviously there was something happening there that was pointing towards a more creative line of work.
I find that fascinating because advertising, if nothing else, is storytelling. You're creating a story about this product or service or whatever it is, and you're trying to tell that story to potential customers so that they'll come take advantage of the thing that you're trying to. Was there anything in that industry that piqued your interest that you could kind of see the foreshadowing of what you would become?
Well, it's a good question because I think there is some synergy between the two careers because ultimately you're connecting, when you write stories, you're making a connection with your reader. And when you're working on a brand and advertising for them or dealing with the marketing, you're trying to forge a connection between a potential customer and a brand. And I think working out what your audience wants and how to reach them and how to connect is key in both careers. And I would say that I cut my teeth on with that element in advertising. So even though it wasn't clear to me at that time, it was something that I enjoyed doing and of course enjoy doing now longer term.
Lucy, I've met a number of mystery writers, thriller writers, crime fiction writers, and invariably they all end up just being the nicest, sweetest people you could ever meet. And they write some of the most twisty, sometimes horrific things that you've ever written. And I always laugh about that because these are the sweetest, nicest people that their imaginations just go in some really interesting places. What was your first encounter with mysteries or thrillers that really piqued your imagination?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when I started writing my debut novel, it was called Swimming at Night in the US, and actually in the UK, it's called The Sea Sisters. And it was at the time where psychological thrillers, which is how I'm sort of positioned now, really were just taking off in quite a big way, certainly in the UK. And I think I was sort of I think I'd written a book that was suspense and mystery and emotional mystery. And it's quite difficult to position books like that because there's either the more general women's fiction area or the straight crime thriller area. And sometimes as a writer, you can fall in between the two tables, and you need to have kind of a clear package to be able to say to readers and booksellers, how to connect with those people, like we were talking about with advertising. So I never saw myself to begin with as a writer of thrillers. I was just writing the type of books that I wanted to read, which were ones that focused on people doing the sorts of things I was doing, that were traveling, but that had a really kind of suspenseful hook in them. So I became, over time, I'd say quite gradually, when I am now, so One of the Girls is my seventh psychological thriller. And I think over that journey, my books have perhaps become darker because I've really enjoyed tapping into that suspenseful thriller element. But it almost in a way has happened very naturally and wasn't where I started, if that makes sense.
Sure. There's been a really interesting thing that's happened in suspense thrillers, especially, and a lot of the subgenres, the domestic suspense and the romantic suspense and things like that, where a lot of earlier traditional mysteries, you might see, especially the female roles being a lot of times you have these. I'm trying to find the words to describe what I'm trying to say. A lot of times there would be female roles that were very stereotypical, the weak woman, the woman who needs to be rescued, and in especially the last decade or so, there's been an interesting twist where a lot of times the antagonist it is a woman, and sometimes that it's a whole different power structure, if you will. Have you, since kind of being in this space, have you noticed a change in the way that we see stereotypical characters and stories?
I think it's a really positive change, because you're absolutely right that the role of women in thrillers particularly was that panicked woman who was being hunted or chased, or thinking that she was losing her mind because things weren't happening as she was being told they were. And so I love this change of women having more varied roles. And of course, you still have those roles too, because that's life, isn't it? And we're all mixed. Right. But I think it just feels a much more interesting time to be reading thrillers, because we've got some brilliantly strong women leading the charge, and so we should, and I love it. So it's really fabulous when you read books with interesting female leads.
Sure. So Lucy, you said you were doing some traveling of your own and realized that you enjoyed keeping a travel log of sort, a diary of your exploits. How do you transition from there to writing the Sea Sisters? What changed that kind of opened up this new story for you?
Well, when I got back from this trip, I was away for 6 months, and when I got back, I decided to write my first novel, which is always it's quite a nerve-wracking prospect. And I didn't have any formal training because my English literature degree had no creative writing element. So I just got to my local library and took out all the books they had on the shelves about how to write a novel, and I read them all. I read lots of other novels in the type of area that I thought I wanted to write in, and I would read with a pen in my hand, sort of underlining things that I thought were interesting, or trying to analyze the structure or why they view certain points of view. And I suppose I just sort of taught myself what I believe to be, the way to write a book. And with that novel, I managed to find an agent, but unfortunately, I had a great agent who I'm still with now, but she never managed to sell that first novel. And I remember thinking at the time, it was just such a hard kick because, as I'm sure people listening know, it can be very hard to get a literary agent. So when you've got one, you feel like, this is it. This is a great step. I'm getting closer. And I did loads of work on that book, and, lots of edits that she had suggested. And anyway, we didn't find a home for it. And I was incredibly disappointed. I'd spent 2.5 years writing the book. I had a second job at the time, as I needed to, earn money like everyone else. So I asked her, what do I do here? And she said, you just take a deep breath now and you write your next one, which of course is, easier said than done. But that is what I did. And to go back to part of your question about the travel journal, I actually went back to the journal I'd kept when I was away on that 6-month trip. And I thought, do you know what? There's something in the very act of having a travel journal that is quite fascinating to me. I love the fact that they speak of a travel journal, speaks of all the places that you've been. You've got the sand in the spine of it itself, the smears of sun cream or bits that a coaster that you've kept from a bar you visited. And I started thinking, what if someone's travel journal was found, but they were dead? And what would it reveal about the manner of their death and the weeks leading up to it? And that was the starting point for the Sea Sisters, or Swimming at Night, as it's called in the US. So it's funny when, you look back at decisions you've made and things that you've done and how it all filters in some way to where you are now. I always find that really interesting.
I know that it had to be very discouraging to not sell that first novel that you invested 2.5 years into. But I know there's a lot of people listening who are thankful that you didn't sell that book, because they're like, yes, someone else has had the same experience that I've had. That is more the rule than the exception. I think a lot of times we invest so much into this story idea that just doesn't pan out for whatever reason, and you just have to go do it again. And I don't know, I don't know of a lot of creative pursuits that come down to a high stakes gamble like that. Like, I just have to start over from scratch, from nothing, and do it all over again, and maybe that one will sell. That's such a huge leap. Being 7 novels later, do you look back at that original manuscript, the one that didn't sell, and can you see from the vantage point where you are now why that book didn't sell? Can you see the problems with it, or was it just a story that just never fully came into its own?
I think it wasn't good enough. And I read it or reread it 2 years ago, and I could see it was good enough to hook an agent, and it was good enough. I could have got lucky and got a deal with it. And I came very close, actually. I had two publishers that took it to their acquisitions meeting. So it was very, very touch and go. But now, with the beauty of hindsight, I look back and think I'm so pleased that that didn't get published, because it could have done. It was borderline, and I'm sure with a good editor as well, I would have improved it further, and it would have been good enough for publication. But actually, it never had the hook to go on to be a strong enough book to launch me. And I think when you're a debut novelist, it's very hard to break into. You get your book deal, but it's still incredibly hard to make a dent in the sort of readership, because there's so many people doing it, and it's just hard to reach people. And I think to go out with a book that was pretty good but not amazing would have done me no favors. And definitely The Sea Sisters was a much stronger book, and it meant that over here in the UK we have a big book club called the Richard and Judy Book Club, and it was selected to be part of that book club, and it just really launched my career for me. And it also meant I got a lot of international deals, and the original idea just didn't have the right flavor to sell internationally. So it's nice now to look back and know that happened for a reason. But of course, in the middle of the rejections and having to write the next one, thinking, is it going to happen all over again? It doesn't feel great. And that's where you need to kind of just dig deep, really, and just stay committed to what the goal is, which is doing something hopefully that you love without necessarily seeing the end game as the be all and end all, but enjoying where you can the process of it.
Right. I love your story, Lucy, of how you learned to write, and by going to the library and getting books and just kind of deconstructing stories that were published. And maybe this is an unfair question to ask, because that is how you did it, and you didn't study creative writing in school per se, but you did study English literature, and you obviously were immersed in stories in various aspects. But are you glad that's the education that you got, kind of the taking stories, deconstructing them, seeing what worked, as opposed to more of an academic, someone lecturing, this is how stories work? Do you think it's better to find stories that are working, that are out in the world, that are connecting with people, and finding out, what it was that made those tick?
Yeah, I think that for me, the learning from home myself, just as you say, by deconstructing what I was reading and being inquisitive ultimately, it suited me. It suited me at that time because I didn't have the money to pay for a course, and it suited me because it's really an apprenticeship of my own making, I suppose. But I also think there's such merit in creative writing courses, and there's some wonderful MAs that just have bred so many fantastic writers. So I think both approaches can really work, and it's really fitting it to what stage you're at, what options you have open to you. I'm actually a perpetual learner, so the fact that I taught myself doesn't really fit with my personality, because I love learning things. I'll sign up for any class. I absolutely love it. And I think now, had I had the money, I probably would have hopped straight in on a creative writing MA.
Sure.
So I think there's so much merit in it. But yes, even now I will routinely read and reread books on how to write novels when I'm reading and actually more recently, I've had my third novel, The Blue, is in production with Paramount Plus, and it's being made into a 7-part series. And I've been really interested, having been part of the scripting process, to read books on how to write screenplays, because there's such a broad crossover.
Right.
And I still read with a pen in my hand when I'm reading other people's novels. So I'm one of those people that friends will say, oh, what books, do you recommend? And I'll always have a list of them. And they'll say, oh, can I borrow them? And I'm that awful person that says, well, either you can, but they're written I've written all over them, or you can't because I need to go back to them for reference and see what I've underlined and why.
Lucy, after your book, The Sea Sisters, your next book, A Single Breath, I love to ask people about this point in their author journey, because there's a thing that happens with your first book, and I like to call it the gift of anonymity. You're writing that first book, or you have written it, and you're trying to find a place for it out in the world, and you've got your family and close friends who maybe know that you've written this book, and you're trying to sell it. And in your case, you had a literary agent. So you've got a handful of people that are on your side, and kind of rooting for you, and wanting to know the news of what's next. But the wider reading world in general doesn't know who Lucy Clarke is, and is not a fan. That they're not against you, but they don't know to expect anything from you. And so you have this interesting point in your career where it's just the freedom of creating, and and then all the behind the scenes work of getting the book out there, but no one's expecting anything from you. But then the second book comes along. You've got the Sea Sisters out there. It's finding an audience. People are learning to love who you are as an author, and start having these expectations in their mind of what's Lucy's next book going to be like, and what's the journey she's going to take us on with that. So then that second book, A Single Breath, it comes out in a very different atmosphere than that first book did.
Yes.
What was that experience like for you?
I think where I was perhaps fortunate with A Single Breath in the writing process was that I sold the Sea Sisters all over the world, or my agent did. And luckily for me, it wasn't published anywhere for over a year after I sold it. So there was a really long lead time. So I actually had a solid 12 months to start writing book 2 before I had any expectations from readers, certainly, about what I was going to produce. And so I felt like with that book, I had, again, a fairly free run of writing what I wanted to before I got input. Because now, of course, like I'm on book 7 and I've read all of my reviews, and I know what readers like and what they expect and what I'm associated with, and what publishers, how they are sort of positioning me to build a brand effectively. So you definitely have a lot more expectation on you. And I think it can be both a good thing and a bad thing. And for me, the positive is that I now have a much clearer sense of my own voice as a writer. I know what I enjoy writing. I always stay very firm to that, so I won't be swayed by market trends or other people's opinions, but I am much clearer in knowing the elements of a book that I love writing. The disadvantage, of course, is that you have lots and lots of other voices in your head whilst you're writing. 1,000 critics basically sort of giving you their opinion, and it can just be quite hard sometimes to close those down and find quiet, because it's all a confidence game, writing. And I know when I'm drafting a manuscript, some days I could read the same chapters and think they're brilliant if my mood is up, and other days I can read those chapters and think it's awful and I need to start again. And it's just working out like, hold on, what's the real opinion here, and what's just, confidence having too much of a role in this discussion with myself. So I think that carries on, through the second book and beyond actually the expectations.
So then you come to book 7, and it's time to start creating what will become One of the Girls. Mm-hmm. And at the, when that cycle of the previous book is over, the great equalizer for every new book project, no matter how successful the author is the blank page. There comes a point where it's time to start a new book and you have nothing. It's just you and, a brand new word processor file or whatever it is. When you first start thinking about a new book, I'm fascinated with the moment of inspiration. At one moment in time, one of the girls does not exist in any form or fashion in any way. It just doesn't exist. And then you start maybe playing the what if game, and maybe there's a news article or something that you've watched on television or seen online, or maybe this a scenario comes to mind, and you start casting it with characters that you make up in your mind, or whatever that first moment is. And then one of the girls does exist, and it's your job as the author to kind of dig down and excavate that thing and pull it out of the ground and polish it off, and then a book is born. What is that first moment of inspiration like for you?
The first moment is different for me with each of my books, and I typically have, for every book that I write, I will usually submit to my publisher and agent a sort of A4 sheet with 6 ideas on, between sort of 5 and 6 ideas, and there'll just be a couple of sentences each. Excuse me, no more than just a hook. And how those ideas might come about can be in any way at all. And I have a envelope at home. It's just a big envelope, and anytime I have an idea, I scribble it down on a post-it note, an index card, a scrap of paper, whatever, and it gets posted into this envelope. And then when I'm finished working on whatever book I have been busily on deadline with, I'll then go to the envelope and look through and see, out of the ideas I scribbled down, what chimes, what still resonates, what am I interested in exploring further. And from there, I'll sort of work them up into, very short sort of premise, effectively, which I will then share with my publisher and agent, as mentioned. For one of the girls, the starting point was incredibly simple for me. It was just, I was very interested in setting something on a hen weekend, which here, that's the English term for it, but I think it's a bachelorette party in the US.
Yeah.
And why that interested me is because I have been on lots of hen weekends, hen parties, and I find they're somewhere between joyful and horrendous, depending on whose it is, because you're mixed together with a group of women who, some you may know, some you've never met in your life. You could be very different. You might have different ideas about what a good weekend entails. And particularly when you go away somewhere, you've got that added pressure of you being sort of trapped with a group of people that you might not ordinarily be spend time with, who you also perhaps don't know the bulk of them very well. And I just thought that was quite fertile grounds for exploring character work and potentially thriller elements. So that was all I had as a starting point. And actually, very unusually for me. So that was it. That was the hook. Not much to it. I just thought, I'm going to put a group of women on a hen weekend and know that by the end of that weekend, one of them will die. That was, the starting point. That was where I believed the novel was going. When we went into our first lockdown in the pandemic, I had just given in a draft of my 6th novel, The Castaways, and I thought, okay, it normally takes my editors 2-3 weeks to get back to me with their feedback, so I'm just going to explore this idea a bit further. Excuse me. And I actually just spent 2 days planning the novel, and I worked out where the hen weekend would take place. And I thought about these female characters, very briefly, who they would be. And I set them off on this weekend together. And I didn't know who was going to be the killer or who would die. I didn't have any of that mapped out. I just knew it would be on a Greek island in a beautiful villa overlooking a private cove, and yes, 48 hours of planning. And then I began writing, and I had a really, for me, incredibly unusual writing process, because normally I will plan things out and I might spend a couple of months doing that. But with one of the girls, I decided to be character led and just start writing in multiple viewpoints from each of the 6 women's vantage point and see what story unfolded. And I think perhaps because we were in lockdown and I came off social media, I stopped watching the news, I basically disconnected from the world and was simply at home with my family. I had a really intensely creative time, and I wrote the entire first draft of that novel in 17 days. Whereas a typical first draft might take me 6 to 8 months. So It was just, for me, really different and really exciting. It was the most butterflies in my stomach, like akin to sort of falling in love feeling I can describe. And it was, those moments of heightened creativity come with every book, but are usually very fleeting. I might have half a day here or nothing for like another month, and then just a couple of hours while it feels beautiful. But with one of the girls, it was just like 17 days of just sheer propulsive joy with my writing. And I felt so privileged to have that experience, because I've not had it before, and I'm not sure if I'll have it again. I think it was just a moment in time and a book that just lent itself to coming out in that way. So yeah, that was for me how the germ of the idea came, and how it sort of then seeded very quickly.
Forming good writing habits is so important. If you're a professional writer, you need to be able to sit down and write 500, 1,000 words, 2,000 words a day, and no matter what the circumstances are, you need to know how to be a professional at it. And a lot of people figure when they start a new book, okay, if I'm going to get 1,000 words a day and this book is going to be 80, 90,000 words, then a first draft should take me 3 months, and then I'll take a couple of weeks off, and then I'll start the revising process, and then maybe a couple of months after that. And you kind of start thinking about the life of a book before you turn it into your editor is maybe 5 or 6 months long, and then another couple of months of revisions with an editor, and and you start kind of forming what would be a typical book cycle in your mind. What you never can account for is these moments of just inspiration that take over. Like you said, 17 days is amazing, and it absolutely can happen when the story is ripe for telling. Did it feel like you just had a tiger by the tail and you were along for the ride?
Absolutely. And it's annoying to say that, because I love hearing other writers talk about process. And I thought that when writers said, they step into their characters' voices and the story writes themselves, I felt like it was an incredibly pretentious thing to say, and I had certainly never experienced it. And so I feel like, embarrassed to even say that is actually true and that can happen. And it did happen. And I have since tried to recreate the conditions of lockdown, and that's 17 days for the book that I'm working on now. But unfortunately, it hasn't unfolded in quite the magical way it did during those 17 days. So I think I think there's definitely a lot of magic involved in this process, and you can't always you can't always plan everything, because like you say, inspiration can come and go. And I'm also a firm believer, despite having that wonderful period of creativity and productivity, I am also believe very strongly that you get to your desk and you show up every day, whether you feel it or not. And that is what I do. I get up at 6 every day. I write in the mornings, and my working day finishes. I have 2 young children, and I pick them up from school at 3. So that's my creative day. And some days that's massively productive, and other days it's completely dead. But I'm there at my desk and showing up, and that's kind of the best that you can do, I think.
I'm glad you brought up a little bit ago the fact that the book is written from multiple viewpoints, because that that story structure that you came up with really adds to the mystery and the sort of the feeling that as a reader you get that you really have no idea who who I should be rooting for, who I should be cautiously watching, because we're getting inside the thoughts and feelings of a number of characters. As you start kind of getting into these characters, and you know that the story has to go somewhere, and you know that it's ultimately coming to a point where some bad stuff is going to happen. Do you ever feel like you get too close to a character to turn them into someone that could do dastardly things?
Absolutely. I think you get to a point sometimes where, you've had perhaps a thought like, oh, this character is going to be the killer. And then you fall in love with them and you think, well, now, yes, they can be, a difficult person and they're complex, and I could see their motivation for killing someone, but you like them too much to give them that fate, or you understand their vulnerabilities too much. So I absolutely had that during the writing of one of the girls. My sort of idea of who would end up being killed, and I obviously can't give anything away, but changed very dramatically for me, because I like the character too much to kill her off. So that does happen, and then that is when you have to listen closely to your character voices and see where they're leading the story, which perhaps wasn't in the original direction that you may have assumed.
And I think you're absolutely right. The unsettled nature of the story is what really drives it forward. One of the girls is, and I feel like we can't talk about the story anymore, Lucy. We're going to give it away. I just have to tell everyone, go out and grab it. It's available everywhere today. We're going to have links in the show notes where you can get it in Kindle edition, or hold the paper in your hand from Amazon, or go visit your local bookstore. It's available everywhere today. One of the Girls, a must-have for the summer reading season. Lucy, if people are just discovering you and want to dig into all the great stuff that you're up to, where can they connect with you online?
I'm on Instagram as Lucy Clarke Author, and Facebook and Twitter. And also I have a website, so you can find my email through that as well if anyone wants to email rather than social media. So I love hearing from readers. So please do come and say hello. I would love that.
Excellent. We'll be sure to put a link there to make it easy for folks to find you. Lucy, this has been so much fun chatting. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me, Hank.